Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Jordan Center for Persian Studies. I think I have seen most of you, and I see some new faces. We're very glad to have you. If you wish to be on our mailing list, you could put your email down on the sheet in front, and you'll be getting information about the programs that we have throughout the year. My name is Mir-Djalali. I'm the director of the center, and it is a great pleasure to have with us for not only today but the entire week Professor Miguel Toledo, who is, before this talk, is going to be teaching Pahlavi for a week here, intensive Pahlavi. The lectures were made possible through a grant by Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali, or Dr. Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali, which has allowed us to bring Professor Toledo from Europe. I'd like to thank her and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation for their support. And also, I should say, the reason that we're able to have him for the entire week is really through the generosity and really the kindness of Dr. Ardeshir Babakmian. I really thank you for all that you're doing. So again, thank you so much. Amongst you, you have both from the community and some of the faculty and graduate students here with us. So I think this is really a good mix. And I know you're not here to hear me, but allow me to just briefly introduce Professor Toledo. Miguel Ángel Andrés Toledo is Associate Professor at the Department of Classical Philology and Indo-European Linguistics of the University of Salamanca, Spain, where he has also had other positions as a postdoctoral research assistant at the Institute for Iranistik at the Freie Universität in Berlin, has been an associate professor and Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He has also been at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel as a postdoc fellow. And most recently, before taking this position, he was the Ehsan Yarshater lecturer in Avesta and Pahlavi languages and literature at the University of Toronto. Now, having said that, and he has a number of articles that I am not going to actually read through, but he's quite adept in many languages. He has an article on Vedic, Avestan, and Greek sunrise, the dawn of an Indo-European formula, two popular articles on, let's say, the Sasanians, El Imperio Sasanida, in Historia Nacional Geographic, in Spanish National Geographic. His book is, which was published about a year and a half ago, the Zoroastrian Law to Expel the Demons, Videvdad, chapters 10 through 15, a critical edition, translation, and glossary of the Avestan and Pahlavi texts. So, here we go, another translation of a part of the Videvdad. Why is that important? Well, ladies and gentlemen, people who deal with the Avestan world and Avestan text have been used to using this Gellner's edition of the Avesta. And as I've been told, Gellner used, of course, a number of manuscripts. What Professor Toledo has done is to look at a series of actually manuscripts, more than 100 manuscripts. So this is not putting two manuscripts next to each other. And what they've done, and he and Professor Cantera as well, are really providing us with a new reading of the Avesta. So what we thought was the standard reading of the Avesta is going to be completely changed. Because the new manuscripts or the alternative manuscripts are giving us actually a different interface. So that is why his work is so exciting in the field of ancient Iranian studies. And I hope I've not missed anybody else, but without further ado, Professor Toledo is going to be talking about Not That Lost in Translation, Sasanian Exegesis of the Avesta. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I thank all the audience for coming here on a Sunday evening, I know. And thanks to Turaj, thanks of course to Elahe and Mir-Djalali, thanks to Dr. Babaknia for his hospitality, and of course to the Jordan Center of Persian Studies for inviting me. So, I will talk about a very specific topic related to the Avestan text, but especially their interpretation, their exegesis. I will be focused on the Sasanian period because it's one of the important corpus of literature we have, but as we will see, it's not the only type of exegesis of Avestan texts we have in the literature of ancient and middle Iranian languages. So, first of all, I know that many people in the audience have a very deep knowledge of what's the Avesta, but for some other people in the audience who probably don't know enough, I will give a very short introduction about what we call Avesta in the Avestan literature. Then the second part of the presentation will be about non-Sasanian exegesis of Avestan texts, which is many times forgotten in the literature. And after that, I will focus on the Sasanian exegesis, in concrete, of course, the Pahlavi translations of Avestan texts. And to understand them properly, we will have to talk about the native morphosyntactic knowledge, the linguistic knowledge of the native tradition, also the lexical tradition, the native lexical tradition, how important it was for the Pahlavi translations in the exegesis of Avestan texts. And finally, I will take a very short, very concrete example, not from the lexical point of view, but taking into account from a concrete semantic field how the technique of the Pahlavi translations work. So first of all, what is the Avesta? What we call Avesta. As you see, the term Avesta designates a conglomerate of texts, of religious texts, composed in a language, the oldest of the Iranian group that we call Avestan because of the Avesta properly. A language that was spoken during the second and first millennia BC. These compositions, as many of you know, were orally transmitted during many centuries and learned by heart by Zoroastrian priests at priestly schools throughout many centuries until they were put down into writing in manuscripts, the oldest of which go back to the 13th century AD. You can imagine, of course, there is a long gap between the oral and the written transmission. But as many of you know, the Zoroastrian priests continued to learn by heart the text and transmitted them in a very good condition until they were put down into writing in manuscripts. The Avestan literature, as I said, is mostly of religious content. And we have it in three types of manuscripts. It is preserved in three types of manuscripts. The ones that we call Saadeh in Persian, pure, that are the so-called liturgical manuscripts, the so-called exegetical manuscripts, that are the ones with Pahlavi translations, and another type that was discovered very recently, that is a type of combined manuscript. We will see what's that exactly. First of all, an example of a liturgical manuscript. You have in the picture a very beautiful manuscript, an illuminated manuscript that was discovered a few years ago. It's in Iran, in the Majles library, and it's the type of liturgical manuscript that is long or short liturgies, in which various Avestan texts are usually combined, and ritual instructions in different languages depending on the place of copy of the manuscript. If it is in India, there will be ritual instructions in Sanskrit or Gujarati. If they were in Iran, they were copied in Iran, they will be in Pahlavi or New Persian. As you see in this text, of course, many of you will not identify the language, I can understand, but everything is in the same language. Everything is Avesta. Now, you will see the difference with an exegetical manuscript. You will say, wow, what's that? This is actually the oldest Pahlavi Vivedta manuscript and one of the oldest manuscripts of the
Avestan literature preserved. An exegetical manuscript is actually a collection deprived of ritual context. And you find the Avestan text in a line, and immediately after, it's Pahlavi translation. So you have line of Avestan, Pahlavi translation, line of Avestan, Pahlavi translation, and so on. For instance, in this line, the Avestan text starts, you have Părăsat Zarathustro Ahuramazdan, Zarathustra asked Ahuramazda in Avestan, and its Pahlavi translation after the Avestan text, immediately here, Ursi Zardusht as Ahuramazd. In Pahlavi, exactly the same, but in another language, literally, Zardusht, which is the name of Zarathustra in Pahlavi, asked Ahuramazda. So this is an example of an exegetical manuscript, and now one of the new ones, a combined manuscript. Why we can call it combined manuscript? Because actually it's a sade, a liturgical manuscript with an interlinear Pahlavi translation that was added later. So it's not exactly a liturgical manuscript in the proper sense of the others, and it is also not exactly an exegetical manuscript because its main use is ritual. So this is a very interesting example that was discovered a few years ago also in Iran, and it is preserved in the Tehran University, and it's a unique manuscript and very important also for the establishment of the text. So after this very, very short and very general introduction, what's the Avestan literature about? We can go to the non-Sasanian exegesis of Avestan texts. Again, the most famous one is the Pahlavi translation, the Sasanian exegesis of Avestan texts, but it was not so late. Actually, the interpretation of Avestan texts goes back to a much older period. First of all, we have young Avestan exegesis of old Avestan texts. In the Avestan language, we have two layers. The so-called Old Avestan texts that are the Gathas, the Yasna Haptanhaiti, and some of the most important prayers of the Zoroastrians, and other layer that is a little bit younger and is also dialectically different is another dialect that we call Young Avestan. We have a very interesting example of Young Avestan commentaries to the Old Avestan prayers, the Yatha Ahu Bailio, the Hashem Bohu, and the Ehe Hatan, in the Yasna 19 to 21. This is a well-known example in the scholarly community of interpretation of Young Avestan commentaries of Old Avestan. But this is not usually as well known. There are also Young Avestan texts, Young Avestan exegesis of Young Avestan texts. You would say what? As in the Vedic tradition, in which we have, for instance, commentary of the Vedic text in Vedic language and also in a later layer that we call Sanskrit, the so-called Brahmana, for instance, are commentaries of the Vedic literature. We probably had something similar in Avestan, but almost everything went lost. But how can we know that there were commentaries of Young Avestan texts in Young Avestan? We have few examples in some glosses, explanatory glosses, and in very small and short commentaries. Here we find a very interesting example. In the Videdat 841, I will just read the English translation, not to make it too long, we find a passage in which, in the context of a purification ceremony that is called the Varesh Num, which is one of the most important purification ceremonies in Zoroastrianism since antiquity, we find a passage in which it is said, "Maker of the material creatures, righteous, and if the wood waters reach first the top of the head, which part does this lie Nasu, the demon of impurity, hurl itself to?" And Ahura Mazda said, "Then this lie Nasu, demon of impurity, hurls itself towards him or her." That's a linguistic problem, and how it was solved. He in Avestan could be masculine or feminine. That's a problem because in the description of the Vareshan, every part of the body is mentioned. And of course, in certain moments of the ceremony, it's not the same if the person is a man or a woman. So they had to distinguish if this he, this pronoun, refers to him or her. In Avestan, it could be the same word, him or her. So they added in young Avestan a gloss, ho, na, which is literally this man, in order to specify that the pronoun is a masculine pronoun, because it is referring to a man. This is a gloss in young Avestan explaining a young Avestan text. But there are many more examples. This type of procedure, by the way, we will find very, very frequently in the Pahlavi translations of Avestan text. And as you see, it's much older. Another example, we find it again in the Vedanta, but in another chapter, in the chapter 13, dealing with the treatment of dogs. A very concrete question. Maker of the material creatures, righteous, whoever gives scarce food to a dog, that is a young dog, how many of these actions make him a sinner? And Ahura Mazda said, as if in this material life he would give scarce food to an underage, a minor, able to perform competently a ritual, actionable, that's a very technical term in Avestan, shiaufna, Buddhism, that required an explanation because it was not so evident, not so clear. So they changed the compound shiaufna Buddhism into Buddhizya shiaufna, into a verbal structure that is literally to be translated, he may do an action. He's legally responsible, that's what they mean. But because the compound was not evident by itself, it required a short explanation that is also in Young Avesta. So again, a very short commentary, as you would find in the Sasanian Exegesis, in the Pahlavi translations and commentaries, but in an older language, Young Avesta. There are many more. I will just choose another one that is very interesting, but it's not an explanatory, very short gloss. It's a long commentary, actually, also in Young Avesta. In the Yash 5, to the goddess Anahita, we find a very complete passage in which Anahita is described as wearing a beaver cloth, a beaver fur, probably. And it is literally said, she's clothed with beaver clothes, Aredui Sura Anahita, with the fur of 30 beavers that bear 4 young ones. For it is the most beautiful she-beaver, insofar as it is the most heavy. And now, in Yankavestan, they included a gloss long enough we could consider a commentary, in which it is described what's the beaver. The she-beaver, because it's feminine in Avestan, is an aquatic animal. When turned at the right time, the skins shine to the beholders in full silver and gold. This is a gloss to the word Babrish, Babraina Vastra, which is beaver clothes, describing what's exactly this animal. So it's a kind of zoological explanation in Young Avesta. Very interesting. There is another example, but in order not to take so many, I will stop it here. Apart from Avestan exegesis of Avestan texts, do we have the same in non-Pahlavi, in non, so to say, Sasanian language? Of course, we have. So it's not exclusive of Avestan, not exclusive of Pahlavi. According to an Armenian author, we had also Parthian translations and commentaries of Avestan texts. The Armenian author, Elahe, in the History of Ordan and the Armenian World, talks about a Zoroastrian high priest in the region of Apar that was a very important authority, and according to the translation, for he was the governing religious authority of the land of Apar, and more enthusiastic in magician, and more versed in the Zoroastrian religion than most wise men. Furthermore, what they consider a great glory in their very hierarchy, because of course he was a Christian author, so he was criticizing, he had the title of Hamagdeh. He also needed Amparkash, had learned that it was Vagit, and was versed, and this is the important part, in the Pahlavic and the Paskadeh. We will talk about these two terms right now. For these are the 5 doctrines which comprise all the religion of Majesm. But beyond this, there is a further 6, which they call Etymology. All these words would be, of course, worth commenting, but we will just take into account the ones related to the Pahlavi and the Pahlavi. What are these? According to the scholar James Russell, who studied these passages, the Pahlavi and Parskaden are evidently Parthian and Persian schools of teaching, each perhaps having its own zand. Zand is the term in Pahlavi for the Pahlavi translation with commentaries that were very frequent in the Sasanian period in the language that we call Pahlavi. So again, Parthian exegesis of Avestan texts. Very interesting. But unfortunately unpreserved. We have no single manuscript that tells us about this very interesting Parthian exegesis of Avestan literature. But again, because of this reference, we can infer it probably existed. What else? There were other languages. There were Sogdian exegesis of Avestan texts. Luckily, we just have an example, but likely preserved, of a Sogdian fragment, the so-called Sogdian fragment 4, in the British Library, very deeply studied by Sims Williams and Leszewicz, and some other scholars. And this is a Sogdian translation of the very important Zoroastrian prayer, Hashem Bohu. We have here, Uletem U Shtem Yashtai, which is Hashem Bohu V'Ishtem Asti, Ushta Yashtai, Ushta Qatmai, which is the Sogdian version of Ushta Asti, Ushta Qatmai, and so on and so on. This is a very interesting example of an Oriental Iranian, Middle Iranian language in the oriental part of the Sasanian Empire, and later Sogdiana, the province of Sogdiana, with a very concrete example of a translation into Sogdian of a Zoroastrian prayer. Again, when we have translations, we have exegesis also. And now we move to the Sasanian exegesis, the Pahlavi translations of Avestan texts. These are our most important material in the terms of exegesis of Avestan texts, because we have luckily a lot of manuscripts that preserve Avestan texts with Pahlavi translations of most of the important ceremonies of Zoroastrians. Why the Pahlavi translations are important, you could ask? For many reasons. Some of them are listed here. They are first our main textual material for the study of Sasanian Zoroastrianism. Second, they are the half of all extant texts in the Pahlavi literature. Third, they are the source of most Zoroastrian religious literature during post-Sasanian times. And fourth, also very relevant, they were the key to scholarly approaches to the Avesta. You have to remind that the first translation into an European language that was made by the French scholar Anquetil du Perron took into account first the Pahlavi translations of Avestan texts. Anquetil du Perron translated, so to say, the Avesta thanks to the help of the Indian Parsi Dasturs, one of them, important one, Dastur Arab, who was reading the Pahlavi translation of the Avestan text and helping him decipher the original Avesta. So actually, our first approach, scholarly approach to the Avesta, is mediated through the Pahlavi translations. That's why they are also very important. Pahlavi translations and commentaries of Avestan text is what we call Zand in the Pahlavi language. It's a term taken from Pahlavi, were composed and transmitted by different exegetical schools during the Sasanian period. In the Pahlavi sources, the terms Avastag and Zand, Avastag is the original Pahlavi term from which the term Avesta derives. We call it Avesta because of this Pahlavi word, Avastag, and what Avastag and Zand means. Avesta and its Pahlavi translation with commentaries. These terms together, Avastag and Zand, designate the whole corpus of authoritative Zoroastrian literature. Pahlavi translations were composed during different periods, and that's important. This is something that was discovered thanks to the very important study by Alberto Cantera in a book in German that is called Studien zur Pahlavi Recession, the most important contribution on the topic, and he could distinguish layers of composition of Pahlavi translations. So not all of them were composed during the same period. Some are older, some are later. According to his study and some other studies, we could make more or less a difference in 3 layers, the so-called Sasanian Pahlavi translations from the 3rd to the 7th centuries. Some of them very important texts like the Yasna, the Víspera, the Videblat, and some others were composed during the Sasanian period. We have also post-Sasanian Pahlavi translations during the period in which Islam, the Islamic religion, was ruling in Iran. Still, Zoroastrian literature was composed, and also Pahlavi translations of Avesta texts were composed. Some of them, translations of the Yasht and of many parts of the Horde Avesta during the 8th to the 10th centuries. But even in very, very modern periods, we have Pahlavi translations of Avestan texts, what we call, I would call them Neo-Pahlavi translations, in late manuscripts, but usually trying to fill the gaps in older manuscripts, because some of the Greek manuscripts with Pahlavi translation don't have the full translation. Sometimes there are gaps. In later periods, some scholars, some Parsi scholars, and also Iranian scholars filled the gaps thanks to the help of some important religious authorities. These texts were composed in the 18th and 19th century. Some parts, for instance, of the Ishtas Yash, the Pahlavi translation of this text, and the Videblat 12, the Pahlavi translation of which is not preserved in the oldest manuscripts. To understand how the Pahlavi translations work, we have to take into account many things. But first of all, a question to the public. If you have to translate, let's say for instance, a Japanese text into English, what would you need first? Any of you can reply. A dictionary? What else? Grammar. A grammar, exactly. Because if you don't know the language, you can have the best dictionary in the world, you would understand nothing, of course, so it could be quite difficult at least. So these are 2 pillars in the exegetical process of translation. The first of all is the native morphosyntactic knowledge, the morphology and the syntax of the language and how they were able to interpret it. First of all, something also discovered by Alberto Cantera, we had 2 types of recension of the Avestan corpus. Our Avesta is basically the remain of one of them, what we would call, according to the Vedic terminology, the Pada Pata. What's that? It's actually a recension of the text where words and their components are separated by a dot in the Avestan manuscripts. This is the type of Avestan transmission we have in almost all manuscripts. After every single Avestan word, we have a dot. That's very interesting and very easy, because of course then you can differentiate the words and their components, but again, that's not something that was invented. As such, that's part of a very old tradition that's also shared with the Vedic tradition, because in the Vedic tradition we have also both types of transmission. We have the one in which every single word is divided, and another one in which all the words are in a chain, without separation. Imagine that I'm saying, for instance, there is no division between lines, but I'm not writing, there is any division. I'm writing everything together. There is no division. You would say, you need some knowledge of the language, some grammatical analysis in order to be able to cut the words, to interpret where each word starts and finishes. This is actually a morphosyntactic analysis that requires a linguistic knowledge. And of course, they had that linguistic knowledge. Again, as I said, this is the Padapata recension. There is another recension that we call, according to the Vedic terminology, Samhitapata, which is the one in which no division of word is attested. There are remnants of that also in our extant Avestan, because we also have complete words that were not divided or wrong division sometimes, that of course make us think that there was also another type of transmission that is not preserved but existed. This is an example of a Pada-Pata transmission, the one cutting every single word. As you see here, I will move here to point. You see after every single word a dot, maralt, dot, ahuo, dot, maso, dot, and so on and so on. Every single word is divided. Again, that requires a grammatical analysis. Sasanian translators and commentators rendered the Avestan Padapaka, recension, the one cutting the words, into Pahlavi. But a very interesting thing that was not always noticed, Alberto noticed, but not many scholars. They even transferred the use of the Avestan dot to the Pahlavi translation by using a vertical stroke. In Pahlavi, a vertical stroke, a kind of line, is used to divide words many, many times. It's not a rule, it's not like in Avestan, which is always regular, but it's exactly the same type of division, and it's probably copied from the old system of dividing the words. The point, very interesting point, is if the use of this stroke to separate words and their components was taken from the Sanskrit grammar, in which we find exactly the same, the so-called danda, which is the stroke, or was a common use, we don't know, could be. There are Sasanian sources that tell us that in the Sasanian period, the kings, or the religious authorities, borrowed grammar from India, so could be, but perhaps not. We are not sure. But it's, again, the same use. That's not by chance probably. Here we find some examples of the Avestan use of a dot. The Avestan use of a dot is not only to separate words, sometimes it's to separate suffixes and preverbs. It's a very sophisticated knowledge, grammatical knowledge, which of course requires a tradition. It's not something we learn from one day, it's something that requires a tradition. For instance, the word Gathahua in the Gathas, if we translate from Avestan, is separated into Gatha, which is what we would call in modern linguistics the stem of the word, and Ua, which is the ending of a concrete case, that is the locative plus a preposition. They could identify that this is the ending. That's very interesting, the suffix. Another example, Ashawa Bio. They again separated the suffix, the ending, Bio, which is the instrument, dative plural also. Do we find something similar in Pahlavi? We do. We have, for instance, in some of the manuscripts, Ahlavan, the righteous ones, is separated into Ahlab, and then the ending An, which is the ending for the plural. Very interesting, exactly the same. Using, in this case, not a dot, but the stroke. I can show you also in a complete manuscript. You see, oh sorry. You see here is the word in Pahlavi, Hlab, then the stroke, and then An, the ending An. It's exactly the same like in Avestan, but using the stroke. So again, a morphosyntactic analysis of the texts. But that's not the only thing you need. Again, you also need a dictionary. You need a lexical tradition, because we have a very interesting example, one of the few preserved, that we call the Frahan I Oin Ek, which is a dictionary, Avestan, Pahlavi. It is called Frahan Dictionary I Oin Ek. Oin is one in Avestan, Ek is one in Pahlavi, because they are the two first words of the dictionary. Here I also copied a very interesting example, not only to tell you a dictionary Avestan Pahlavi existed, which is interesting enough. It also incorporated one of the very few descriptions of grammatical knowledge they had in the Sasanian period. We find the definition of some morphemes in Avestan. That's a very, very deep grammatical knowledge. In Pahlavi, we find, I will translate just from English, just into English. These are other morphemes from Avestan, masculine and feminine. Of course, they knew probably that there was a neuter, but in this passage it is not mentioned. But they identify the difference between masculine and feminine. In Pahlavi, there is no difference, with the exception of very few examples in which there is a feminine. There is no difference between masculine and feminine. They knew that Avestan has this distinction, but they also knew something that didn't exist in Pahlavi, that there is also a dual. In Avestan we have singular, plural, singular for one thing, plural for many things, dual for things that go in couples. This is a special ending in Avesta. Never attested, not existent in Pahlavi, but they could identify in Avesta. So again, remnant of a very, very concrete grammatical knowledge. They also could distinguish a very interesting thing, which is the distinction in the Avestan vocabulary between good and bad terms. In Avestan, depending on the type of person you address or animal, you use a verb or a substantive that is different if the person or animal is evil. They could also identify this distinction. They could also identify the difference of the adjective between positive, comparative, and superlative. And they could even distinguish some of the endings of the cases, like for instance, the ablative, the instrumental, and the dative. The cases for the things that come from ablative, instrumental, come with, or dative, go to, or for. After this, we can just take a look to the lexical thing, the interpretation of very concrete terms, and how the technique of this translation worked. These are the 5 types of criteria they could use when translating Avestan terms into Pahlavi. First, they could use long words, which means they adapt into Pahlavi the phonetic of the word in Avestan, because either they don't know what's that exactly, or they consider it a technical term that doesn't deserve a translation. It must be borrowed from the original language. So this is one of the techniques. Another one is the etymological translation, probably based on phonetic similarity, so things that sound more or less the same and mean the same, actually. There is another technique, which are the so-called synonymic translations, so they use a different term that is semantically very close or exactly the same. They could also find another word from the same semantic field, and they can even reinterpret the word into the new culture. For instance, in the case of a concrete semantic field, the semantic field of textile terms, we have a very nice example. Avestan atka or atka, mantle or cloak, literally adapted as a long word into adak in a very concrete passage of the Nera Avesta. This is exactly the same word taken as a long word. This is one of the techniques. Another one, sorry for the typos there, is the etymological translation based on phonetic similarity. We have the Proto-Indo-European root west, which is to wear, the same English actually, the same word. Avestan vastra, which is garment, and Pahlavi vastarak, etymologically the same, and almost always regularly translated by the same word. Did they know that vas means to wear? We don't know, but they chose exactly the same etymology, exactly the same word in the Sasanian language. Another example is, for instance, Proto-Indo-European drep, which is to cut off. Avestan drafsha, banner, and Pahlavi drafsh, exactly the same. Another technique, very interesting one, is the synonymic translation. There is a very interesting word, which is althrawan, which literally means footwear. In some manuscripts, by the way, it was confused with a very important word, which is athravan, which is a priest. But althrawan is literally althra, shoe, van, having shoe, literally. We can translate footwear. In a synonymic translation procedure, they would choose a kind of similar term with more or less the same meaning. It's quite synonym. Pai, which is foot, ba'anak, protecting. So protecting the foot is footwear, literally. So it's a synonymic translation. They could also find another word from the same semantic field. It would be what we would call it, we would be purist in the translation, a wrong translation, but not too far away, so to say. In the example of ubdaena or ubdaeni in Avestan, which is woven, translated into Pahlavi tadag, which is not woven but spun. It's not exactly the same technique, but well, more or less it's related, so they think, well, it's not a huge mistake. So it's basically from the same semantic field. And in some very interesting cases, they could even reinterpret the word. For instance, there is another very interesting passage related to textile terms in the Nera Avestan, and there is a word no one knows what's that in Avestan, which is Sadayanti. It is between two terms, one of them is for, another one is probably a type of textile, and something called Sadayanti. What's that? We don't know. But how they interpret that in the Sasanian period, with a very interesting term that is anachronistic, but for them it makes sense, which is a silk brocade. They know that they are discussing some textile terms, they probably think that it's something you have to wear. They decided it could be a silk brocade, but of course, in the Avestan time, where Avestan-speaking population were in Central Asia, there were no silk brocades, so it's anachronistic. But for them, it makes sense. It's basically a reinterpretation. So, summing up, more or less, we could say that of course the Pahlavi translations are a very important source for our understanding of the Avestan text, but again, we have to take into account that they are not the only example, they are not an isolated example of exegesis of Avestan text. They go back to a very, very old tradition, according to some scholars like Alberto Cantera, probably even Indo-Iranian, because in many things it's similar to the Vedic tradition, and we have always to take into account this in order to properly understand the Avestan text, its Pahlavi translations, and many more texts of the Pahlavi language and of the Zoroastrian literature. So, thank you very much for your patience.